I predicted Donald Trump in 2016. I predicted Ronald Reagan in 1984, George H.W. Bush in 1988, George W. Bush in 2004. And under my system, a lot would have to go wrong for Biden to lose.
Donald Trump has been convicted of falsifying business records in his hush money trial. It is the first time in history that a former US president has been convicted of a crime. You've been getting in touch. Please continue. He was found guilty on all 34 counts that he faced. Unanimity was required for any one of those counts. Well, let's talk to Professor Allan Lichtman, who is Distinguished Professor of History at the American University and author of The Keys to the White House. Professor, hello to you. Thank you for joining us.
Certainly.
Professor of History, taking the long view, can you sum up what this means?
This verdict is of enormous historic significance. Not only has no former president ever even been charged with a crime, neither has any major party candidate been charged with a crime. Now we have Donald Trump convicted not just of one felony, but 34 felonies. Above all, this is a great victory for democracy and the rule of law in America. You know, Donald Trump lies about all of this, saying this was a fix, this was rigged. Nonsense. The judge was eminently fair, even bent over backwards to be more differential Donald Trump than virtually any other defendant. Donald Trump and his lawyers had an ample opportunity to question the jurors. They had ample opportunity to present their defense. Trump was not convicted by Joe Biden or his political enemies, but by a jury of 12 ordinary Americans. The system worked.
But
You know,
Alan,
Donald
I
Trump.
put that to another distinguished professor, Alan Dershowitz, an hour or so ago, and he says, no, the jury got it wrong, and so did the district attorney. This should have been a misdemeanor, and then it became felony. This was weaponization of the justice system, and this shows that the system, the guardrails, failed, and as a result, we're going to see similar things being done by Republican DAs, Republican prosecutors up and down the country. This was a very bad move and a very bad day for justice in America.
I would answer that in one word: bunk. Dershowitz has been in the bag for Donald Trump for years. He has been an apologist for Donald Trump. There was nothing weaponized or rigged here in any way, and they haven't pointed to anything in the trial that was unfair to Donald Trump, who had complete opportunity to strike jurors, to make his defense, to present his facts. They presented in defense one witness who turned out to be a disaster for the defense, basically confirming that Trump and Giuliani were trying to silence Michael Cohen. You know, Republicans for decades have claimed to be the party of law and order. And now here is Donald Trump and apologists like Dershowitz doing everything in their power to subvert and trash the rule of law in America.
But Dershowitz says he doesn't even like Donald Trump. He voted for Biden last time. He's going to vote for him again. But it's about the law, pure and simple. It's about separation of powers. He says this was a political trial held in a city that is 90% Democrat. Donald Trump had no chance with that jury.
This, again, is Republican lies and propaganda. I don't care what Dershowitz says. You know, he makes believe he's a liberal, but he's been in the bag for Trump for years, even made bogus arguments at Trump's impeachment trial. We don't have Republican and Democratic juries in this country. You know, once you start doing that, the rule of law is over. You know, not Dershowitz, not any other critic has pointed to anything that was wrong with this trial, how this trial was any different from any other trial that gave the defendant a complete opportunity to deal with jury selection, to present their case. They presented no case whatsoever. They basically had no defense.
Professor, you're the author of
the rule of law and the
Yes.
jury system, and not listen to apologists like Dershowitz.
Professor, you're the author of The Keys to the White House, and you outline a prediction system for determining the outcome of presidential elections in the US. And our listeners will be interested to know that you have correctly predicted the winner of each presidential race since 1984 using your 13 keys system. What impact do you think this verdict will have on people's voting intentions come November? Because some of the people we've been speaking to think it will have no verdict, or sorry, no impact. Indeed, it may push some people, independents, the other way toward Trump, not against him.
Yeah, let me say, unlike someone like Dershowitz, I've been purely impartial in my predictions. I predicted Donald Trump in 2016. I predicted Ronald Reagan in 1984, George H.W. Bush in 1988, George W. Bush in 2004. And under my system, a lot would have to go wrong for Biden to lose. This verdict is outside the context of my system, which is based on history, but there can be cataclysmic, unprecedented events like this one that can influence the election. Forget all the hot air you've heard. Nobody knows what the impact is going to be, but let's presume for a moment it doesn't crack Trump's base. That's not proven, but that doesn't matter. Trump cannot win with his base. It's too small. He's got to win over swing voters, moderates, and independents. And that's where this verdict of 34 felonies is likely to impact.
So when you hear that Trump is ahead in some of those key swing states, possibly ahead enough if he maintains that lead to swing the election for him, despite January the 6th, despite all these felonies, despite these verdicts and what is to come in the next year or so, you say what?
I say, as I've been saying for 40 years, forget the polls, forget the pundits. They lead you down the primrose path of error, just as they did in 2016. Even the eminent Princeton University consortium of great professors using the polls said the probability of a Clinton win was 99%. Early polls have zero predictive value, and even late polls. The latest polls in 2012 had Romney beating Barack Obama. So keep
Aha, you've suddenly dropped out,
unlike
Professor.
the polls
You're
has
there,
been
sorry.
right for 40 years.
Right. And Professor, we're going to switch, we think, over to the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, who was hammered by his political opponents for pushing this particular case. How would you assess his performance?
Outstanding. I mean, his office, I thought, presented an overwhelmingly compelling case. I have a live show, and your audience should check it out to follow my keys. 9 p.m. DC time every Thursday, and you can find it at Allan Lichtman, YouTube, ALLAN. And I predicted, based on the excellent presentation of the DA's office and the lack of a real defense, that Trump, in fact, would be convicted, and that was borne out. The system worked. Trump's allies can scream and yell and cry, but this is the way law and order works. And if they claim to be the party of law and order, they've got to stop attacking our system of law and order.
What do you think this does to the division in the country, to all those concerns? And something like 66% of Americans polled by, I think it was Ipsos Mori in the States last week, said they were concerned about political violence in the near future. What impact do you think this particular historic decision, this verdict, does to that atmosphere?
I don't think there'll be political violence. Trump has called for massive demonstrations to support him in this trial, and it was a huge fizzle. Virtually nobody showed up. Even his wife didn't show up. His daughter Ivanka didn't even show up. So this is something that Republicans are trying to scare Americans about. Oh my God, if the system comes down on Donald Trump, we're going to have civil war, civil strife. Nonsense. That's not going to happen. The American people are way beyond that.
All right. Professor Allan Lichtman, thank you very much indeed. And Professor Lichtman is a distinguished academic, professor of history at the American University and author of The Keys to the White House. And he's got this prediction system which has correctly predicted the winner of each presidential race since 1984. Will, hello to you.
Hello, Henry.
How do you feel right now? It's concluded, you've written your story, it's out there, and this is historic. What say you?
Is It is historic. It came very quickly. We were all sitting there feeling rather sort of almost lackadaisical in the courtroom, and there was an overflow room where we were being allowed to sort of sit, and we were all sort of gossiping, and we all sort of, I must admit, thought that the verdict might come tomorrow or even on Monday, and we'd all been busy trying to make arrangements to make sure we got into court the next day and so on. And then the judge said that he was going to go and speak to the jury because it was about 4:15 in the afternoon, and he said, I'm going to go and tell them that I'm going to excuse them at 4:30. And then he didn't come back for a bit of time. And when he came back, he said, I have a note, and the note was signed at 4:20 p.m. And it said, we have a verdict. And so, I mean, it was almost quite shocking. And he then said, we need to give them half an hour to fill in the form. So no one knew what the verdict was. I think there was a suspicion that it would probably be a guilty verdict. It could possibly have been a mixed verdict, but that it would be a guilty verdict just because it had been reached relatively quickly and that there were fewer signs of a sort of dispute amongst the jury, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. And Will, given that you sat through that whole trial, you assessed the witnesses, I mean, all the witnesses for the prosecution and the one for the defense, and you saw them being trashed in various ways, particularly Michael Cohen. And then when you heard, on the basis of that evidence, the jury had returned a verdict, a unanimous one, on all 34 counts, what did you think?
Well, it was interesting. The questions the jury had been asking were questions that suggested that they accepted quite a lot of the prosecution's story. So, for instance, they were asking for transcripts to be read back to them of David Pecker's testimony. Now, the prosecution said that David Pecker had corroborated Michael Cohen's testimony about what happened, and they said, you don't need to trust Michael Cohen, whatever you think of him, because you have this corroborating witness. And one of the first things the jury asked for was this same testimony that was read back to them. So it was one of those things where you sort of thought, sometimes you wondered if they might find a quit Trump on some of the charges where, for instance, he didn't sign the checks himself, and so it could have perhaps been a split verdict. But when the foreman stood up and started reading out the verdict, and with the first verdict was guilty, and then he just kept saying guilty, 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 and his voice sort of quite soft in the courtroom and sort of echoing as he said it. It was really quite a shock to actually see it happen.
And Will, what do you think this does to the mood, not just in the city, but more broadly across the country? I mean, Trump, of course, is saying this shows the system's rigged. We're losing our country. I'm going to fight for you. It's about the Constitution. Some of his supporters are saying this is lawfare. I mean, one of our listeners, Phil in Bedfordshire, says the Democrats weaponize the judiciary. The USA has fallen to third world levels of corruption. The culpability is not the point. That's an interesting point there, Phil. What do you think? What does it do to the atmosphere?
Well, I mean, there will certainly be plenty of Trump supporters who will feel that he's been prosecuted in Manhattan by a district attorney who did campaign on the basis that he had taken Trump to court multiple times over other matters. However, I think Trump's accusation that this has all been orchestrated by Joe Biden, I don't know how far that will be accepted, just because this is a state case. It's been brought sort of by a state prosecutor. But I certainly think that Trump supporters will accept and agree with him that he's being somehow persecuted. We've heard quite a few of them outside the courtroom just now saying the same. There have been opinion polls saying that that voters sort of who are in the middle, who don't really have an opinion either way on how they're going to vote, that some of those voters might blanch at the thought of voting for someone who's been convicted of a crime. And so a lot of people have wondered whether a conviction will in some way change the calculus or change the polls. But a lot of people are also quite skeptical because Trump is very much a known quantity. He's been president before. This is a story that's been around since 2018. So its effect is really hard to gauge at the moment.
Yeah, and just looking at screens in front of me, I've got all the main UK and rolling news networks, and we're essentially rolling with this story too. What's the coverage like where you are?
That's a very good question, Henry.
You probably don't know because you've been busy writing the story, haven't you?
I'm afraid I don't know. I mean, I've seen all my colleagues scribbling away, and I've seen, but since then, I'm afraid I've been in the park sort of interviewing people. Lots of New Yorkers turned out when they heard that there was a verdict. Quite a few Trump supporters turned out too, although I think they were fairly outnumbered, this being Manhattan.